Before the flood, the world was not destroyed simply because of human wickedness. According to an ancient book, they tried to erase from history. Celestial beings descended to earth, took human wives, taught forbidden knowledge, and fathered a race of giants. For centuries, this book was read alongside the scriptures we know today. And then, quietly, deliberately, it was removed, buried, declared forbidden. Enoch was not a king, not a warrior. He was an ordinary man chosen for one purpose: to witness what no human was meant to see. What he saw changed everything. What he wrote was dangerous enough to be silenced for 2,000 years. This is not a story about religion. It is not a debate about faith. It is the account of what this book claims happened: a betrayal in heaven, a corruption on earth, a race of giants, and why God himself had to intervene. This is the Book of Enoch. It all began with a rebellion, not on earth, but in the heavens. There were beings called the Watchers, angels appointed to observe the world below. They were not sent to rule it. They were not sent to desire it. They were meant to watch creation, to guard the order between heaven and earth, and to remain separate from the lives of mortal men. They looked down and saw the daughters of men, and desire entered heaven. The line that was never meant to be crossed began to tremble. These beings, powerful and ancient, saw human women not as part of the world they were meant to observe, but as something they wanted to possess. One by one, that desire became a conspiracy. Their leader was called Semyaza. He knew the act they were about to commit would not be forgiven. He knew that if only some of them descended, the rest might abandon him and leave him to face judgment alone. So he demanded an oath. 200 watchers gathered together and swore that none of them would turn back. They bound themselves by a curse. Then they descended. Their arrival was said to have taken place upon Mount Hermon, a mountain whose very name became tied to the oath they made there. From that height, the Watchers stepped into the world of men, not as messengers of God, not as protectors, but as rebels. And with their descent, the ancient world changed forever. They took wives from among human women. They entered the houses, the tribes, the bloodlines of mankind. What had once been separate was now joined together. What had once been forbidden was now done openly. Heaven had crossed into earth, and earth was not ready for what followed. The Watchers did not descend with armies. They did not need to. They brought something far more dangerous, knowledge mankind was not ready to carry. Among them, one name stands darker than the rest: Azazel. He was the first to arm mankind. He taught men how to take metal from the earth and turn it into blades, swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. Before Azazel, men fought with what nature gave them. After him, violence had form. It had craftsmanship. War was no longer only rage. War became an art, and once mankind learned that art, the world could not return to innocence. But Azazel did not stop with weapons. He also taught the making of ornaments and the use of precious stones to beautify the face. War and seduction appeared side by side, as if they were two edges of the same blade. Beauty itself became a weapon, sharpened by vanity and desire. The others followed. Semyaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. Armaros taught how to undo those same spells. Baraka revealed the secrets of astrology, while others taught the paths of the moon and the reading of omens. Each was a master of a different forbidden art, and humanity received all of it. They did not resist them. They listened. They learned. They opened their hands and accepted it. The sky was no longer only the sky. The earth was no longer only the earth. Everything became something to control, to bend, and to use. Kings became crueler. The weak were crushed by those who mastered these new powers first. The world before the flood did not collapse in a single night. It was taught how to collapse. Every secret became another crack in creation. Every forbidden art made the boundary between heaven and earth harder to restore. And above it all were the Watchers, as the world of men began to resemble their own rebellion. But knowledge without wisdom is a fire given to children. The Watchers had not only changed what mankind could do, they had changed what mankind could become. Because from the breaking of this ancient boundary, something new was about to rise, something immense, something unnatural. The world was about to meet what this union had produced, and it was not ready. Then the consequence appeared, not as a warning, but as flesh. From the joining of the Watchers and the daughters of men came beings unlike anything the earth had seen before, the Nephilim. They were not simply large men, they were a rupture made flesh, the result of heaven crossing into earth, of divine rebellion entering human blood. They entered the world already wrong, already too large, already too hungry. Some records describe their scale in numbers so extreme, they stop being measurements and become statements, as if creation itself had been stretched beyond what it was built to hold. At first, humanity may have looked at them with awe, living proof that the world had changed, a new race standing between heaven and earth. But awe does not last when hunger begins. The Nephilim consumed everything the world could give them. The labor of entire communities disappeared into them. Fields were stripped. Livestock were slaughtered. What took men weeks to grow, the Nephilim devoured in hours. And when the world could no longer feed them, their hunger turned against mankind. The age before the flood became an age of terror. They began to devour human flesh and drink the blood of men. Violence was no longer an act of war or survival. It had become the natural state of a world that no longer had boundaries. The forbidden knowledge had armed humanity, but the Nephilim revealed how powerless humanity still was. The weapons Azazel had taught men to forge were not enough. The enchantments offered no protection. Mankind had received the tools to destroy itself, and now something far worse had arrived to finish the work. The earth itself began to suffer. It was no longer simply wicked, it was infected. This was a cosmic violation reaching its final form. Every step of the Nephilim was a reminder that the Watchers had created something the earth was never designed to hold. Mankind was not on the edge of collapse, it was already falling. And in the chaos, in the violence, in the blood that soaked the ground, something was rising. Not from the Nephilim, not from the Watchers, but from the earth itself. A cry. A sound that had been building since the moment the first Watcher set foot upon Mount Hermon. The earth was calling out, and for the first time since the descent began, someone above was listening. The cry rose from a world pushed beyond the limits of creation, reaching past the stars, all the way to the throne of God, and it was heard. Now, only one thing remained. A messenger was needed. One man had been chosen to walk between worlds and deliver the final word to the rebels themselves. A man who walked with God, Enoch. Enoch did not choose this. He lived quietly in a world that had become anything but quiet. But when the sentences of God were handed down, the fallen ones did something unexpected. The Watchers, those who had descended with such pride, began to tremble. They asked Enoch to intercede for them, sending a mortal man to plead their case before the throne they had abandoned. Enoch wrote their petition, recording their fear and their plea for mercy. And then God called him upward. What followed is described with the breathless detail of someone trying to find words for the unspeakable. Enoch was lifted by winds and carried past the clouds. He saw the hidden architecture of creation, the storehouses of the winds, the paths of the stars, and the chambers of light. He realized then that the universe was not chaos. It was order, measure, and command. This made the rebellion of the Watchers even darker. They hadn't just broken a rule, they had violated the very structure of existence. Finally, Enoch stood before the house of God, walls of crystal, a floor of fire, and a ceiling of stars. At the center, a throne of crystal surrounded by streams of flaming fire. Enoch fell on his face, shaking, unable to look. And then, a voice, gentle yet overwhelming, spoke the answer to the Watchers' petition. There would be no mercy. The Watchers had known truth and order. They had chosen to descend with open eyes. While the men born of women could be forgiven for their ignorance, the Watchers had no such shield. Their petition was rejected. Their judgment was sealed. Enoch was shown the places prepared for the righteous, filled with light and peace. But he also saw the mountains of fire and the abysses of darkness prepared for the heavenly beings who had abandoned their stations. When he was brought back, Enoch carried knowledge heavier than anything Azazel had ever taught. He had gone as a messenger for the Watchers, but he returned as a witness for God. He stood before the rebels and delivered the word they feared most. There would be no peace for them, no return to heaven. Their children would perish, and their names would be remembered in shame. The Watchers had taught mankind forbidden things. Now they would learn something older than knowledge: consequence. 4 names answered in the heavens: Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. The archangels, beings of a different order, looked down and saw what the world had become. Their report was not a petition, it was a testimony. They described an earth drenched in blood and named Azazel specifically, holding him responsible for teaching mankind the arts of war and vanity. They spoke of a world that had not simply fallen into sin, but a world that had been pushed. Then God spoke. The sentences came one by one, precise, measured, without rage, which made them more terrifying than any storm. To Raphael, the command was clear: bind Azazel, cast him into the darkness, and bury him beneath the jagged rocks of the desert of Dudael. There he will remain in silence until the day of final judgment, when he will be thrown into the fire. To Gabriel, move against the Nephilim, turn their own violence against them until they destroy one another. What the earth had been forced to carry, the earth would be relieved of, letting the offspring of rebellion perish by their own hands. To Michael, confront Semyaza and the Watchers who followed him. Bind them beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations. Let them witness the destruction of their children. Let them see the end of what they swore to protect on Mount Hermon, and let them carry that sight into eternity. And to the earth itself, a promise. What had been corrupted would be cleansed. But restoration required destruction first. The Watchers had believed their oath would protect them. They had bound themselves together so none would stand alone when judgment came. But no oath made in rebellion could protect them from the throne above. Their children would fall. Their leader would be chained. Their teacher would be buried in darkness. The age before the flood had reached its sentence. Judgment was no longer coming. It had already arrived. But the judgment could not stop with the Watchers. The stain they left behind had spread too far. The world was still infected, and if creation was to be truly cleansed, the sentence had to fall upon the earth itself. The sentence had to fall upon the earth itself, not because the earth was evil, but because it had been invaded. The flood was not a punishment born of divine frustration. In the world of Enoch, it was something deeper, colder, and far more terrifying: a divine execution. The waters were not sent because mankind had failed, but because mankind had been corrupted. There is a difference. One is guilt, the other is infection. And you do not punish an infection, you cleanse it. The world God had made had been altered. Heaven had been dragged into flesh, and the stain had entered the bloodlines, the soil, and the very memory of humanity. So the judgment came as water, not fire, not armies, water. Because water does not conquer a world from the outside. It enters everything. It finds every crack. covers every monument and silences every voice. It makes no distinction between weapon and crown, giant and king. The sky opened, the deep broke apart, and the world of the Watchers began to disappear. The Nephilim, those immense children of rebellion, could not stand against it. Their strength, once the terror of mankind, became useless before a judgment that rose higher than anything flesh could climb. They destroyed one another as God had commanded, and the waters finished what remained. For the Watchers, this was the cruelest part of the sentence. They were not allowed to save their children. Bound beneath the hills, condemned to darkness, they witnessed through their chains as everything they had built was unmade. The oath sworn on Mount Hermon had bound them together in rebellion. Now, it bound them together in ruin. This was not chaos, it was correction. The flood did not come because God had lost control of creation, but because creation had to be taken back. Every rising wave was a verdict against Azazel. Every vanished kingdom was proof that the world they had built could not be allowed to continue. And yet, one thread remained. Noah. He was the remnant, the thread of uncorrupted humanity that would carry creation forward. The same waters that ended one world lifted him toward the next. When the waters finally receded, the world was quieter, cleaner. The boundary between heaven and earth had been restored, and the forbidden knowledge had been washed away with the civilization that had embraced it. Mankind began again, walking upon an earth that had survived not because it was innocent, but because it had been cleansed. The flood was not the end of the story. It was the answer to the beginning of it. But as the world dried and the silence settled, one question remained. If this story was once known, once read, and once feared, why did so much of the world leave it behind? The flood came, the world was cleansed, and Enoch wrote it all down. So why don't we know this story? The Book of Enoch was not lost by accident. For centuries, it circulated openly. The early church fathers studied it, and the New Testament quotes it directly. It was read alongside Genesis and the Psalms. But in the 4th century, as the church began to formalize the Bible, Enoch was set aside, declared apocryphal, removed. The official reasons were technical, questions of authorship and canon. But the book itself offers a deeper reason, because what the Book of Enoch says changes everything. It complicates the story of evil. In the version most of the world knows, corruption entered through human weakness. But in Enoch's account, it was delivered from above by beings who knew exactly what they were doing. It changes the flood from a simple punishment into a divine response to cosmic contamination. It changes the Nephilim from a passing reference into the center of a forgotten catastrophe. Maybe that is why the book became uncomfortable, too strange for some traditions, too dangerous for others. It indicts something far older and more powerful than humanity. So, over time, Enoch was pushed to the edge, preserved in the highlands of Ethiopia, hidden in the caves of the Dead Sea, rejected, feared, and forgotten. But a story like this does not disappear. It waits in the fragments of ancient manuscripts and in the echoes of fallen angels. It asks a question most are not ready to face. What if the ancient world was not only destroyed because mankind became evil? What if it was destroyed because something came down from heaven and changed us forever? If Enoch is only legend, it is one of the darkest ever written. But if it is true, then the story of our origins is far stranger and more terrifying than we were ever told. Enoch was not a king or a warrior. He was a witness. He saw something, and he wrote it down. For 2,000 years, the world has tried to decide whether or not to believe him. The account you have heard is his. What you do with it is yours.